All right, welcome to the WTOP studios. I'm Megan Cloherty here, joined by Neil Augenstein, and we are breaking down The Investigation Continues, the Lyon Sisters podcast that Neil has produced for WTOP, which you can find on our website and on Podcast One and wherever you get your podcasts. It's the story of the 1975 disappearance of Sheila and Catherine Lyon. They are 12 and 10-year-old sisters who went out to see some Easter decorations in March of 1975 at the Wheaton Plaza, and they never came home. And it was a mystery that no one knew what happened for 40 years. And now in the last week, we are learning more details. Last week, a man was set to go to trial in their killings, even though their bodies had never been found. And now Neil is going to tell us sort of how this case wrapped up. And of course, we'd love to answer some of your questions. If you have them, please send them in. I'm going to be monitoring here on our little iPad to see if Neil can answer the questions you have. So, Neil, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Talk to me about what happened in the Bedford County courtroom last week.
Okay, well, just to bring everyone up to speed, Lloyd Lee Welch was set to go on trial for the 1975 murders of Sheila and Catherine Lyon. And as you mentioned, their bodies were never discovered. Welch, allegedly, according to police, had abducted the girls from Wheaton Plaza Mall, and he said that he'd witnessed somebody sexually assaulting one of the girls, and according also to witnesses, a few days later he was seen on Taylor Mountain, which is a remote wooded area in Bedford County, Virginia, which is 240 miles from Wheaton Plaza. And Welch had with him 2 bloody duffel bags. Each of them supposedly weighed about 60 pounds. And he, according to prosecutors, tossed those bags on a fire that was burning on his family's property, and that was the final resting point for the Lyon sisters, according to prosecutors. Of course, this had never been admitted to in court. So Welch was due to go on trial on last Tuesday. We found out a few days earlier that he was going to plead guilty, and that is what happened. There were some answers given. There were a lot of things that were not answered, and we can go into that a little bit more. The bottom line was that Lloyd Lee Welch, with the Lyon family in the front row of the courtroom, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree felony murder and was sentenced to 48 years in prison for their deaths. He's already serving, he's already in the middle of a 29-year sentence in Delaware for sexually assaulting another young girl there. Right. So by the time his Delaware sentence ends in a few years, he'll then begin 48 years in Virginia prisons. He will be eligible for parole when he's in his mid-80s.
And I know you had a heads up a couple days before this happened because you've been following this case so closely. You've gotten to know the investigators and everyone working on the case. Do you have any indication why this ended in a plea deal versus going to trial?
Well, for one thing, the Lyon family very much wanted this plea deal. I spoke with John McCarthy, who's the Montgomery County prosecutor. We were able to speak afterwards. And he told me that this was really something that the Lyon family wanted. He said that the last 3 years, since Lloyd Lee Welch was named the person of interest and then indicted, has been torture for the Lyon family because all of the details about what happened to the little girls has been revealed, and it's the first time that they've known. As part of the plea deal, Lloyd Lee Welch admitted abducting the girls and said that he knew that they were going to be exploited. But Welch never admitted personally sexually assaulting the girls, and he also never admitted killing the girls. And so that left open the question, if not him, then who?
Right.
But according to Virginia law, if a person is abducted and eventually dies, that is enough to convict them of first-degree felony murder. So that's how he met the standards to plead guilty to first-degree felony murder. The family was looking forward to putting this behind them as much as they possibly could.
Right.
But again, there were so many questions still out there. And getting back to your original question, why did this plea happen? John McCarthy said that he wanted to make this happen because the Lyon family wanted it to happen.
Well, and it's interesting too, the Virginia law thing, because it's sort of a loophole. I mean, you said there's still questions hanging out there. I mean, after 40 years of not knowing what happened to your kids, I can't imagine, like anybody can, how the Lyons family is feeling. Do they still have questions, or did that answer some of their questions?
I've never had the pleasure of speaking with the Lyon family other than a few cursory emails. They've been very private since the girls disappeared. I know that they've wanted to put this behind them. I'm sure that they feel some relief that somebody is paying a serious price for this. While, as I say, that there are still questions out there, that's only according to Lloyd Lee Welch, who has proven to be a pathological liar. And so he has alleged that the girls were sexually assaulted, and he has alleged that other people were involved. And for the last 3 years, investigators have been trying to corroborate all of the stories that Welch has told them, but they have not been able to corroborate any of them, which makes them think that he's lying, and he's trying to play them, and he's trying to drag other people down with him. Right. So it's not clear whether there really is anybody else out there or not.
It's funny because I've been reading your stories. John McCarthy came forward and talked to us last week, the state's attorney for Montgomery County, and he was saying just that he is a pathological liar. How many times has he been interviewed? I mean, you don't know what's left and what's right, and I mean, there's no way to piece this together for investigators. It's very difficult.
When they first named him the person of interest, it was after they had already interviewed him several times, and they said all told he's been interviewed 13 times, and his story has changed 13 times. Wow. So it's very difficult to put any credence in what the man says. Right. And so it's sort of ironic that his words are pretty much the only evidence that prosecutors had. But they also were able to get him to plead guilty. And
you mentioned that he was kind of trying to implicate other people, perhaps, or investigators. Are they satisfied with him being the guy, or do they think there are other persons of interest or other suspects in this case?
They're not sure. I think that some people in the task force believe there are other people to continue to investigate, but Wes Nance, the prosecutor in Bedford County, I asked him if there were any other persons of interest. He said in his part of the case there were none at this point after all the investigation that's been done. Of course, the girls disappeared in Montgomery County. One thing that John McCarthy did say also was that there will not be a prosecution in Montgomery County, where, of course, the girls lived and where Wheaton Plaza is. Right. And he said the reason is he told John Lyon that Lloyd Lee Welch would not plead guilty to the murders if he had to come back to Montgomery County to face a kidnapping charge. So the only thing that he was charged with in Montgomery County was kidnapping. Abduction, right. So it was more important for them to get the murder conviction. So that was why John McCarthy said that he would pass on the prosecution in Montgomery County to make sure that there was the plea deal for the murders.
And as you'll hear in the podcast, Mr. Lyon got up after the plea deal and just said, we're ready to move on and put this behind us. But what was the reaction in the courtroom at that moment? Well,
it was very moving to be in the courtroom when the Lyon family walked in. They were sitting in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. John and Mary Lyon were in the front row, and their sons were also there, and their wives. And they were very quiet, very composed. When Lloyd Lee Welch walked in, escorted by the sheriff's deputy. He looked markedly different than the photos that we've seen before. Right now he's much older. He's 60. He's got a shaved head, big glasses, spoke in a very, very high voice, much less imposing than you might think based on the pictures that we've seen in the past and also the crimes that he's charged with. He sat there. He did have a chain around his ankles, but his hands were free on the defense table. And he listened, and he whispered to his defense attorneys. And the Lyon family certainly did not stare at him. I think that they might have glanced over at him before. I did check and verify that this was the first time that they were ever in the same room with a man charged with killing their girls. Wow. And then afterwards, it was orchestrated. We found out before the plea even happened that the Lyon family would make a statement afterwards. They requested that there be no questions. I think that reporters generally like to ask questions, but I think out of respect and I guess humanity, they came out and they made their 2-minute statement. It was very, very moving. It was good to hear John Lyon's voice. Of course, he was a radio star here in D.C. at WMAL. And, after a while, he wasn't on the air anymore. But when he spoke to give thanks to police and to anyone else who's helped push the case forward, he had his rich baritone voice and, sounded very, very professional, but also very tired and very sad. And he said, "We're tired. We just want to go home." And that was it.
John Lyon, as many in Montgomery County know, has now devoted his life to helping other victims of tragedy and abuse. We have some questions, and I think Ginger, our lovely assistant, has passed these questions. Question from Amy Maddox. I've heard a lot about his uncle being involved. Were there others, family in particular, involved?
Well, the uncle was mentioned as a person of interest very publicly when Welch was indicted, and according to the sources that I spoke with, Lloyd Lee Welch did very often mention this uncle as being involved in the case. But prosecutors and investigators did 3 years of investigating, including more interviews, including gathering physical evidence and having it analyzed. And the only evidence that they had was Lloyd Lee Welch's word. So
Right.
there was no evidence gathered against the uncle, and according to the Bedford County prosecutor, he is now cleared.
Okay. Next question is from Ebenezer Carr. Has he given any indication where the bodies may be? We sort of touched on this in the beginning, but it's a detail we didn't really know. It was the big question.
Well, you know what, and let me just check my phone right this second, because I just put in a question to a source about that recently. The answer is no. It's not clear if Welch ever acknowledged that he did bring the bodies with the in duffel bags up there to the mountain. That's what family members of his did say, and they remember they didn't say it 40 years ago. They said it in 2014 after Lloyd Welch was named the person of interest. So that's something that wasn't revealed for many decades, and I think that there are some family members and there's some human beings who wonder, how is it that you don't reveal that sort of stuff to police 40 years ago? I will say it's possible that things were reported to police back then, and somehow that's fallen through the cracks and isn't remembered. But it was testimony before the grand jury that brought out that Lloyd Welch showed up with the duffel bags. Sort of ironically, the man who told the grand jury about that, whose name is Henry Parker, he died a couple of weeks after making that statement.
Wow.
So it's unclear whether his words could have made it into trial. It would have been a challenge to be able to bring his words into a trial since he had already died. Mm-hmm. But it was, that fact that that was a heavy piece of evidence that prosecutors were able to hold as they went forward in trying to negotiate the deal with Welch.
You're obviously a strong memory to remember for 40 years.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, Laurie Young Miller asks, did Lloyd Lee Welch ever take a lie detector test referencing the girl's disappearance? Thank you.
Yes, he did. According to court records, there was at least one videotaped interview that was that where Lloyd Welch did take a lie detector, and there doesn't seem to be any debate that he was a liar. His defense attorney says that Mr. Welch has told several different stories. Which is code for the guy's a liar,
right?
And the prosecutors didn't spare those niceties, and they out and out called him a liar.
Joanna Camilleri, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, asked a similar question of what happened to the bodies. But Neil, is there anything that you think we've missed or we should touch on? Obviously, the podcast is available, and you can go to WTOP.com and find out how to subscribe and listen to the whole series. But in closing, anything to say specifically about, you've worked on this case for how long?
Yeah, well, I've only worked on it for a couple of years, but of course it's been here for 40 years. I think that there are some heroes in this case that haven't been recognized and haven't been made public. The girl who was 13 who described to a T the man that she saw speaking with Lloyd Lee Welch. She was the friend who generated the police sketch, mm-hmm. which eventually was used to make police realize that this was the same guy. The first Welch family member down in Bedford who described that Lloyd Welch came to visit in the spring of 1975. These are people who have never done interviews and probably won't. I mean, I've talked with both of them.
But they don't want to be a public part of the case.
Well, early on, there was a gag order, and police and prosecutors were asking them not to talk. I think there is a real allegiance or respect, is probably a better word, for the Lyon family, and I think that people who were willing to testify for the prosecution are also willing to, if it will help the Lyon family, to not talk about it mm-hmm. Anymore, and as much as possible try to give the family its peace.
Yeah. Well, the end of a long 4-decade mystery, and you can read all about it on WTOP.com. Again, the podcast that Neil's worked so hard on, the investigation continues. You can find that there as well. Thanks for your questions, and thanks for joining us.